As I said, my name is Wayne, and we're here today to talk about welfarism. This is the Dxc community space. Dxc is an international animal rights network that focuses on empowering networks of animal rights activism. In our flagship campaign, It's Not Food, It's Violence, we've now had, I think it's over 90 cities participate, and 95 cities participate, and this weekend alone we're expecting, I believe, over 50, right? Or is it almost 50 cities are going to be doing demonstrations across the world in solidarity with the open rescue and investigation that we'll be hearing a little bit about over the course of today's presentation. But we have three great presenters, Brian Burns, Sapphire Fine, Priya Sawhney. Will be talking about various aspects of welfarism. I'm going to be offering up just a very brief introduction. And the first thing we should talk about is what welfarism is. And there are at least two common definitions of welfarism. We should distinguish between them before we even start, and they've conventionally been described as welfarism and new welfarism. Now, traditional welfarism is just the notion that what we should be concerned about when it comes to the abuse of animals is the treatment, the welfare of the animals, that the use itself, the killing itself is not fundamentally problematic. What we need to do is just make the conditions more humane. Now, while this is a kind of widespread position in the public at large, for the purposes of this audience and this network, I think traditional welfarism actually is not very interesting. I don't think anyone endorses that position in this room. What's more interesting and more provocative and controversial is what Gary Francione and others have described as new welfarism. And new welfarism is the notion that we should be pursuing certain incremental legal changes that improve the condition of animals, but don't challenge their fundamental property status or their status as inferior beings, because it leads us down the path to animal liberation, that by getting bigger cages and better deaths, somehow we'll ultimately achieve a world where animals are given the equality, the consideration, the lives that they so justly deserve. And this is obviously a very controversial position. But I think there's at least three different perspectives on new welfarism, and I think the focus of today's presentation will be new welfarism that are worth entertaining. The first is that new welfarism is correct, and Bruce Friedrich, among others, is very famous for adopting the position that I'm a new welfarist and I adopt these welfare reforms because I believe it's leading us baby step at a time down the path to animal liberation. And there is at least some anecdotal evidence to suggest this. Bruce Friedrich, for example, cited Switzerland as an example of a country that has adopted many welfare reforms and seems to have a growing vegetarian and vegan community as well. So that's kind of, I'd say, the dominant position within mainstream animal rights advocacy currently. So most of the big mainstream groups like HSUS fully endorse this position. The second position, which is sort of the opposite of Bruce Friedrich's position, is the abolitionist position. This is Gary Francione is most notable for adopting this position, but many grassroots activists, including those at the Abolitionist Vegan Society and Corey Wren, who wrote about us this morning, also adopt this posture that new welfarism not only does it not lead us down the path to liberation and to ultimately improving the status of animals, but it actually impedes the path. It serves as a wall instead of a wedge. And the thinking is that because it induces complacency and allows people to think that all is well in the world of animal agriculture, they can ignore the fundamental problems of speciesism. There's a third position that I think is worth entertaining, which is that new welfarism might not be fundamentally bad or fundamentally good. It might just be irrelevant, right? It might just be a side project that mainstream activists are involved in, and those of us who take a more radical posture should just basically ignore them, right? It doesn't hurt or help us. It's just a different project. And I think I think there are a lot of diversity of perspectives within Dxc. I personally have kind of this view. I think I'm probably lean more towards the stronger abolitionist position towards welfarism. I do consider myself an abolitionist in terms of my ideology and my values. In terms of tactics and strategy, I think that we should at least listen to what folks like Bruce Friedrich have to say, even if we disagree with them quite fervently. So I think there will be a variety of different perspectives offered today, but one important thing to note about the work we do at Dxc is the open rescue that we did and the investigatory work that we're doing and the network building that we're engaged in, I think is valuable regardless of what your position is on these three issues. So for example, new welfarists probably believe, and I know they believe because I've talked to many of them, that while incremental welfare reforms are great, it's important they're actually true. Right? That they're honest. And so, we've had many groups. Vegan.com just posted something about Whole Foods, and I know there are folks at MFA and at Compassion Over Killing who are really concerned about our investigation as well. There are many folks who consider themselves new welfarists who are very concerned about what we revealed about Whole Foods supply chain, because it's showing that they're lies. New welfarists believe that incremental reforms are great, but only if they're actually true, if the companies are being honest. If you're an abolitionist, obviously, then we're providing ammunition for the abolitionist position. We're showing how these welfare reforms, these certification agencies, Prop 2, Humane Farm and Animal Care, Animal Welfare Approved, are actively disguising violence against animals. And we're showcasing how collaborations between animal industry and animal advocates can be extremely problematic. And we've actually taken a lot of flack, including my inbox in email getting lit up by many of my friends who work at organizations like HSUS about calling out HSUS specifically in this investigation. And I don't hate the folks at HSUS. I think they're legitimately a lot of really good people who've dedicated their entire lives to animals at HSUS. But I think these investigations should push them to challenge their own thinking and challenge even the ethics of some of the practices they're engaged in. And I think if animal advocates are endorsing their standards that are actually encouraging and supporting the abuse of animals, it's something we need to rethink. Not just for ethical reasons, but for pragmatic reasons. And then obviously, if you're kind of neutral on new welfarism in the sense that you think it's kind of neither here or neither there, it just doesn't really matter, then this sort of work is really important because it allows us to continue pushing the public beyond just bigger cages and better desks, beyond just happy meat, towards more progress, which is what we're all seeking. Sure. Okay, and just to recapitulate for the microphone, Brian pointed out there are two positions on welfarism that we're going to consider today. The first is that psychologically and sociologically, welfarism will lead us down the path to animal liberation and genuine improvements, fundamental improvements in the status of animals. And the other position is that even if it doesn't lead us down the path to animal liberation and animal rights, it might offer certain concrete improvements to the suffering of animals that are worth considering in deciding whether we should be supporting these sorts of reforms. I guess there's one other thing I should add, which is that Prop 2, which has been in the news, just went into effect in California. And I should emphasize that regardless of what your feeling on Prop 2 is, our investigation absolutely makes clear that Prop 2 does not mean ethical or tolerable or even minimally good, right? Because this was not just a Prop 2 compliant farm, but this farm passed by flying colors. We're talking about approximately 200 square inches on average per bird, in theory, in the farm. Prop 2 requires probably something like 116. It doesn't have a specific number, but it's about half the amount of space that these hens were given. And we found hens in incredible distress, disease, confinement, mutilation, and obviously death. So whatever your feelings on welfarism are, it absolutely is not the end goal, and we have to be absolutely clear about that. And I think that this investigation showed that. So I'll just pass things on now to Sapphire.
Okay, so I'm Sapphire, and I want to talk to you guys about social psychology and how it applies to welfarism. And the three basic things that I want to talk about today are cognitive dissonance theory, the foot in the door technique, and I'll explain what these are, and just sort of how this fits into our movement overall and what implications it has for our movement. So first, cognitive dissonance. This was coined by Leon Festinger in 1957. And it's really important because it changes how we apply to pressure to change. So in order to explain his theory, first we kind of have to understand the idea of consonance. And consonance is basically that people want to see themselves as consistent, that related thoughts and ideas, what we do and what we think, ought to relate in harmonious ways. So if I value education, I want to push my children to go to college, right? That's just typical human psychology. Nobody wants to think of themselves as being inconsistent. So what Leon Festinger defined is cognitive dissonance, and that's when you have two or more cognitions being defined as knowledge, opinions, or beliefs about the environment, oneself, or one's behavior, when two or more cognitions are not in harmony with one another. It's really uncomfortable, and it happens quite a lot. We value health, and yet we don't go to the gym. We value honesty, and yet we find ourselves lying to people, right? And we really want to reduce dissonance. And one of the main points he said about this is that it's a form of motivation. Just like when you're hungry and you want to satiate that hunger and attain fullness, it's very, very psychologically motivating to fix cognitive dissonance. Yeah, so we have basically a psychological drive to have all of our different cognitions in harmony with each other in consistent clusters that make sense. So what can we do about cognitive dissonance? Well, there are kind of four basic solutions that I want to illustrate, and I'll use a pretty classic example, which is smoking, just to illustrate the point. So say I'm a smoker, I find out that smoking is really unhealthy. And given, of course, that I care about my health to some extent, right? So what could I do as a smoker? Well, I could deal with this uncomfortable pressure of knowing that I'm doing something bad for me by changing the attitude discrepant behavior. I could stop smoking. I can tell others to stop smoking. I can completely change the way I respond to this dilemma that I'm having. I could also just modify the conflicting cognition. So about health, I'll just smoke less. I'll smoke sometimes. It's still okay. I can justify what I'm doing by adding a new cognition. So this brand of cigarettes is a lot better for me. This is, yeah, you all see where it's going. And of course, you can also feign ignorance. So the studies are flawed, cigarettes aren't that bad, that kind of thing. Obviously for us, oh, it switched perfectly. Yeah, that's weird. So for us, a much more interesting case is in the context of animal rights, right? So if somebody cares about animals, which is actually a cultural mores, most of us have some amount of care for animals, and they learn about the abuse that goes on in animal industries, and they're having this emotional, visceral, intuitive gut reaction to a moral dilemma that they're having, and they want to fill it in with logic deliberately. They're feeling compassion and yet conflicted, knowing it's inconsistent with animal consumption to feel this way. And this is cognitive dissonance. It arises. So what can this person do? Well, this person can change their belief and behavior regarding animal consumption. They can go vegan, become anti-speciesist, become an activist, right? Completely change the way they approach this. They can modify their conflicting cognition about animal consumption. And I think we've all heard this. I don't really care. I don't really care about animals. And that's kind of denying the other conflicting cognition, right? They can add a new cognition to justify animal consumption. Well, if I buy humane meat, cage-free eggs, humane milk, then it's okay. Or, of course, they can feign ignorance, which is, you know, I need to consume my body weight in protein every day, and vegans are all really unhealthy. So why am I bringing this up? Because all four of those ways of dealing with cognitive dissonance reduce the mental stress, right, we're faced when we have to deal with this moral dilemma. So it's really important to recognize the difference between changing your cognitions and just justifying them by adding new ones. And we have to ask ourselves as animal rights activists what kind of conversation we're bringing to the table when we put animal rights in the forefront and have this conversation with people. And that's because complacency doesn't actually motivate us. A crisis does. And the culture that animal welfare reforms promote doesn't promote motivation to do something, to actually actively go out and do something to fix the situation that animals are in today, right? It reduces mental stress. And this might sound counterintuitive, but if you think about it, you know, this idea that small steps don't necessarily make a big leap forward isn't actually new. When does a smoker or a drug addict go to rehab? Probably not when they found a brand of cigarettes that they consider to be a little bit better for them. They go when they're not feeling like there's some alternative way out. And even politically speaking, like when social conditions are at rock bottom, that's when people are driven to act. And for animals, conditions are at rock bottom. And we need to show the truth about that. Even if reforms are possible, and I think we're gonna have people address kind of what reforms, you know, are actually doing or are not doing, we've got to avoid complacency. And when companies like Whole Foods give people these ideas to justify their behavior, we need to challenge this culture that they're creating. And when we force people to come in contact with the truth, we need to have a clear message to end the attitude discrepant cognition in question. And this ideology behind non-human oppression, as we all know, is speciesism. That's what we actively need to be challenging. The idea that species membership in and of itself is a justifiable basis for deciding who ought to receive moral consideration. And so we need to focus on this, show the inherent violence against when we use animals, and create an anti-speciesist culture instead. As usual. Okay. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. The second one I wanted to bring up is this idea called the foot in the door technique in social psychology terms. And psychologists have often asked how a person can be induced to do something. And this foot in the door technique, or gradualism, suggests that pressure can be applied gradually. You ask a person to do something small, and then when you go and ask them to do something bigger, they've already started seeing themselves, looking at their past behavior, and identify with the cause, and will be more likely to take on that larger request. And people, even if they don't use this by name, in the social psychology jargon, they definitely do use this argument about welfarism, that a small change will motivate people to take on bigger changes. And I think it's important to ask where the social psychology data is coming from and what kind of experiments they're actually doing. What kind of causes are the experimental data actually testing? So in a classic study that was done by Friedman and Fraser in 1966, what they did is they actually asked people to put up this very large, ugly sign that said, "Drive carefully," in their front yards. But some people were asked to first sign a petition that supported safe driving about 3 weeks prior to being asked about the large sign. And those people who had done this small little act of signing a petition were far more likely to put up the large, ugly sign in their backyards, or in their front yards. And so their conclusions were basically that when one agrees to a small action, they feel more involved, they identify with the cause, they see themselves as someone who cares, and that one small freely chosen act of commitment changes self-image. And this is the slippery slope. But does this actually work for animals? So no, I don't think that it does. And that's because the foot in the door method, this gradualism, relies on having one consistent self-image, cognitively speaking. And so when cognitive dissonance is at play and the issue is complex, like it is with animal rights, it doesn't work in the same way. We don't have the data to show that. And so for a non-controversial goal like careful driving, there's no dissonance, right? Everybody agrees with that. Social norms don't interfere. There's no cognitive change required to sign the petition or to put up the sign. So it is a slippery slope in that case. They're connected, they're in line with obviously supportable causes that we all support, but might not see yet. So the foot in the door method just highlights it for us. But what about switching to humane meat versus animal liberation? I don't think that's a slippery slope because switching to humane meat doesn't take a cognitive change. You can absolutely continue on with speciesist way of thinking and switch to humane meat. It's a justification, as we talked about with, cognitive dissonance before. It's not an actual cognitive change. And so the sort of person who buys humane meat isn't necessarily the sort of person who supports animal liberation. It's not the same kind of slippery slope that they're talking about in these studies. Basically, I think my point from this is that when animal rights activists put the issue on the table and we force the tension out into the open, we can't advocate for humane meat at precisely the moment when people are struggling with this emotional, visceral response to a moral dilemma, and they're looking for an easy rationalization that the humane myth offers. So we can't focus on this because it's going to lead to complacency. My kind of overall point with this, and especially in the context of the investigation and, focusing on companies like Whole Foods, they prey on the good intentions of consumers, people who are really the most affected by cognitive dissonance. And it's up to us to counter the lies and to show people the real answer is a liberation movement. We should not be the ones that are supporting them. And so when animal rights activists actually praise these companies, what they're doing is they're falling into the trap that this could be a slippery slope, that this could be a foot in the door or a wedge into people's consciences. And I don't think that it can be. I don't think the social psychology data shows that in any way, shape, or form. And we can't let our message be co-opted this way. So should we actually be against reforms? Honestly, I don't have a good answer to that. I think it's really hard to say, and I think it's going to be really interesting to hear what people have to say regarding the efficacy, because I think that's the other point that really needs to be addressed to decide whether we should be opposed to them or not focus on them. But I think regardless of what the decision is on that, we can't allow it to divert us from the actual goal, which is to fight until every animal is free. So what does social psychology actually tell us to do? Well, I think that the Dxc's principles actually outline this really, really well. So one thing that I think is really important is, so in Dxc's principles, of course, being total animal liberation, nonviolent direct action, telling stories, building a community, and dreaming big. So one point that I think is really interesting to make up is that awareness of oppressed groups in this general context isn't necessarily enough. They talk a lot about creating this kind of awareness of animals in general, and that somehow, welfarism is going to lead to that, and that's going to promote people towards liberation. And I don't think that research shows this at all. So in one field that I studied in college was in the area of stigmatization of mental health. And I had a lot of professors talk about what's the ideal way to have people get intergroup contact with people who have mental health disorders. And the ideal place to meet somebody with, say, bipolar disorder is not when they're strapped to a bed in a psychiatric hospital, right? That's really depersonalizing. It disconnects us from what's similar about them to us, right? To people who don't have mental health disorders. And so contact between majority and oppressed groups isn't enough. Both need to be on equal footing with similar goals to unite them, ideally. And we want to hear about the struggles faced by people who are members of oppressed groups in a way that personalizes them, that shows up as individuals with families, desires, passions, etc., and showing them as, not defined just by that identity, not just as representatives of that group, but as individuals who are really quite similar to us in all the ways that matter morally. And so the same thing goes for all oppressed groups. We, shouldn't be focusing on welfarism because that's going to make people think more about animals as property, and it's going to focus on their status as chattel property, right? So if animal rights activists are focusing on this ideology and they're promoting this type of thought about animal activism, it's not going to promote this kind of intergroup contact. And what will is sharing stories. Obviously, we can't take every single person to an animal sanctuary, but we can share the stories of these animals and how they got into animal sanctuaries and give this personalized touch. And I think what's really important for making these stories work is having a culture and environment that basically fosters this kind of understanding of animals and this kind of change. So we need to change prevailing norms in society, and we need to promote a culture that is anti-speciesist and to personalize non-humans, to show that in every way that matters morally, they are like us, that they want to be happy, to form bonds, to be with their families, etc. And create this culture by sharing our message across our network, across the world, and always dreaming big. And that's what I have to say.
Go ahead.
So, to critics such as the African Americans in Lyme, Connecticut in 1831, the American Colonization Society was simply one of the wildest projects ever patronized by a body of enlightened men. To Garrison, after he saw the light in 1832, the society was a, quote, labyrinth of sophistry. And to James G. Birney, formerly a traveling agent for the society and another convert to immediatism, the Colonization Society was just a, quote, opiate to the conscience. Yet hardly any whites shared these views during the organization's first 15 years, when its actual functions were hidden behind professions of concern for the plight of black slaves and conscientious white slaveholders. Only in retrospect did the extraordinary chameleon-like character of colonization ideology become evident, though it has long continued to mislead and confuse historians. In fact, colonizationist ideology formed a remarkable web of argument that justified the perpetuation of slavery. I'm going to continue. This is a longer quote, but I think it really serves to illustrate what they were about. The most important function of the American Colonization Society was to ensure sectional harmony by offering a platform sufficiently broad and vague on which both slaveholders and non-slaveholders, professed abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, North and South, could stand: the removal of free blacks to Africa. This was its professed purpose, but in fact, colonization served another purpose as well: removing the onus of slavery from the shoulders of Southerners. For Southerners, no objective was more important than to forestall and repress latent agitation against slavery in the free states. Colonization's architects hoped to achieve this by persuading people that gradual emancipation was feasible only if masters were encouraged to free their slaves. In colonizationist propaganda, gradual emancipation thus was made hostage to colonization. It insisted that any agitation that placed masters under moral scrutiny or political pressure or questioned their Christian benevolence would chill the inclination to manumit. Manumit means free slaves. Northern sensitivity to slaveholders' feelings, therefore, was essential if the process of gradual emancipation was to go forward. Nor must one ever speak too harshly of slavery itself, the suffering of the victims and the cruelty of the master, lest slavery become a moral issue for public discussion. So you can see a lot of the kind of, interplays between the discussion of cognitive dissonance. Really, the master purpose of the American Colonization Society was to reduce cognitive dissonance surrounding slavery without actually, performing some kind of solution. In the 1830s, in tandem with a very strong religious revival in the United States, you see the rise of what was then called immediatism and is now called abolitionism. So this is a form of radical activism that began to put slave owners on the defense. A very large group called the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was led by many figures, including the famous Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, started in around 1832. And they began to do very radical activism that challenged the system as a whole and did not necessarily have any kind of concrete goal aside from the immediate abolition of slavery. So a perfect example of this is William Lloyd Garrison in the 1830s went to a public square in, if I'm correct, Boston with a copy of the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution nowadays, I don't think many people care about it as much. But back then, this was maybe what, 80 years or something after the Civil War. There was much more patriotism in society, and the Constitution was almost like a revered religious document. So what William Lloyd Garrison did is he took a copy of the Constitution to a public square in Boston, and declared that this is a pact with slavery, and publicly started to burn the Constitution in front of thousands of people. And he was in fact seized by a lynch mob and was almost murdered. He was only saved by the police, who arrested him for doing this act and threw him in jail and kind of confiscated him from this angry mob that was about to murder him. So this is just kind of a flavor of the style of activism that was done around this point in time. And just to give you an idea of how this was perceived by both folks in the South and folks in the North who were even sympathetic to what they were saying, Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society was referred to as shrill and counterproductive. The other thing to note is that they didn't actually entirely rebuke change, but they demanded the immediate abolition of slavery now in perhaps a gradual sense, as was done in the North. So William Lloyd Garrison is quoted by saying, immediate emancipation gradually achieved. So they did have some idea of how this was going to be politically enacted in a gradual sense. So another thing to note about the growth of these anti-slavery societies is that it was absolutely extraordinary. The American Colonization Society was by and large supported by the U.S. government and wealthy donors, and was not really a grassroots movement. The American Anti-Slavery Society, on the other hand, was kind of on the other end of the spectrum. In 1832, you can see from this chart, they started with 4 chapters around the United States. And through entirely grassroots efforts, people writing letters to each other across the country, collaborating and holding public meetings, they grew in just 6 years by a factor of over 33,000%. So in 1832, there were 4 chapters. In 1838, there were 1,348. So this is truly incredible. And again, it was extremely unpopular, even in the North. When this growth was going on, this was a group of radical people who was very much hated, even by people who were sympathetic to the cause of anti-slavery. So I'm going to read a quote from page 66 about how this growth occurred, in contrast to the American Colonization Society. Abolitionism grew, by contrast, in the teeth of elite hostility, intense popular prejudice, and even physical violence. And it required an exceptional organizational and ideological commitment. So this is in contrast to the American Colonization Society, which had kind of a vague message and didn't really require much commitment aside from some kind of financial contribution from its people. So moreover, historians agree that it was this kind of radical agitation that was necessary to transform cognitive dissonance into action. So I'm going to read another quote from page 124. The consensus among historians is that the abolitionist movement, which was described at the time as shrill and counterproductive, kind of formed the substance of what was to really change society. So where is this? This is page 124. And how it did this was by dramatizing the issue and by increasing, rather than decreasing, the level of cognitive dissonance, so that people who once stood on the fence were forced to act in some way, especially in the North. So Paul Goodman, who wrote this book of One Blood, A History of the Anti-Slavery Movement, says that in the North, apathy and indifference towards slavery were the toughest barriers. Northerners already thought of themselves as opponents of slavery. They had abolished the institution a generation earlier, after all. Most, therefore, regarded slavery as a Southern institution for which Yankees had no responsibility and about which they had no further obligation to think. Nor did they believe they had any right to criticize or interfere. For most, until abolitionist agitation pricked their consciousness, the peculiar institution, which is slavery, was a distant abstraction. So the historical consensus is that this kind of radical movement of grassroots activists that arose around the United States was responsible for raising the tension that eventually rose to such a level that it created the Civil War. The question is, what can we learn from all these things? We've talked about kind of how anti-slavery was enacted in governance from the North and in the early kind of history of the United States. We've talked about the rise of the American Colonization Society, which some activists who converted away from the society referred to as an opiate of the conscience. And we talked briefly about the American Anti-Slavery Society, which stood in contrast, which had a very radical message that was hated by most people in society, but ultimately had an extremely large impact on the movement and ultimately on the fate of many slaves who lived in the United States. So how can we implement some of these lessons in the animal rights movement? The first thing to note, and I was actually having a really good conversation about this yesterday with Joey, is that sometimes incremental reform isn't even necessary. Activism that challenges ideas is often welcome and very effective. So think back to William Lloyd Garrison burning the Constitution as a pact with slavery in Boston. He didn't have any kind of intermediate goal aside from the abolition of slavery itself. And this sheds light on some of these campaigns. We in the animal rights movement often have this idea that every campaign we have to do has to have some kind of concrete impact on some outside institution. Like, for example, at universities, Meatless Mondays is an example of that. Any campaign we have to do has to have some kind of impact on the amount of animal flesh that these universities serve in their cafeterias. But one lesson that we can learn from these movements is that actually sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes it's good to go out and bring new ideas to the public without any kind of immediately achievable reform. The other thing to note was that there were few reforms within the system that succeeded in the anti-slavery movement. In the North, the abolition of slavery happened in a categorical sense, where the property status of black slaves in the U.S. was completely abolished, or was abolished and then phased out by some mechanism. So, how does this implement itself in the animal rights movement? Perhaps it says that we should be looking at strategies like the Non-Human Rights Project more, by abolishing the property status of certain species in a gradual sense. The last thing I wanted to note, and this is how I'm going to conclude my section of the presentation, is that a focus on root causes is essential. This is something that I learned reading about the anti-slavery movement from this amazing book by Paul Goodman. Is I was surprised. I thought that anti-slavery activists, and this was just based on some kind of vague institution that kind of I developed without knowing anything. is that I thought, okay, maybe anti-slavery activists in the 1800s, they advocated for the abolishment of slavery, but they actually didn't talk that much about racism. And that's actually not correct. They talked about very foundational issues of discrimination and racism to a very extensive degree, particularly the American Anti-Slavery Society, not the American Colonization Society. So I just want to read a quote from page 58 on how the American Colonization Society took a very clear stance on racism and even sexism, although some of their language is sexist and speciesist. Paul Goodman writes here, quoting members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, "Our prejudice against the blacks is founded in sheer pride, and it originates in the circumstance that people of their color only are universally allowed to be slaves," Child argued. "We made slavery, and slavery makes prejudice. Color phobia," abolitionists contended, "is irrational, wicked, preposterous, and this is kind of bizarre, unmanly." This is one of the quotes they had. But this gives you a sense of the kind of the vitriol with which they reacted to these things.
It's unmanly.
They argued, "It is contrary to natural rights and Christian teaching, which recognizes no difference based on color. Race prejudiced," Eleazar Wright Jr. exploded, "is a narrow, bitter, selfish, and speciesist, swinish absurdity." So again, just to emphasize, I mean, speciesism is an issue that really isn't talked very much about in the animal rights movement. But if we want to learn from some people who really revolutionized the state of affairs in the United States, we need to be talking about very foundational issues. So that's how I'm going to conclude my presentation. We're going to move on to Priya, who's going to talk more about if animal welfare actually does have a concrete effect on the lives of animals.
Hello everyone, my name is Priya Sawhney and I'm an organizer at Direct Action Everywhere. Thank you all for coming here today. I'm going to be talking very briefly about welfarism and the open rescue some of us in this room did, and following up with what Sapphire and Brian were talking about, and really questioning the effectiveness of welfarism. And then we will see the Dxc investigation that we just recently released, which speaks more volumes to what we are talking about today. Okay, so, and I will also be talking about why framing matters, how companies like Whole Foods and Chipotle use this idea of welfarism to their advantage, to profit, and then lastly, what is the reality and what we found during this investigation. Okay, so the first point is that framing really matters, and welfarist framing ignores animals' lives as individuals, and it also ignores speciesism, and more than often recreates species' ideas by advocating for use of animals. Welfarist framing fails to address the systemic issue or the root cause that Brian was talking about of oppression. And then, as we talked about, welfarist framing advocates for continued use of animals. And most destructively, I think, it creates this impossible image of humane and killing and pairs them together, and then responsible and use, and happy and confined, which, if we think about, is an image that's created by this idea of animal welfare, but in reality, it's a false image. Okay, so Prop 2. Prop 2 is a California law which requires egg-laying hens, which just went into effect, and it requires egg-laying hens to be able to stand up, lie down, turn around, and fully extend their wings. And I found these two articles online, and I just wanted to point out why this welfare framing is so damaging. And this is interesting. It says, if hens realize the better conditions that Prop 2, which goes into effect on January 1st, 2015, ushers in for them, they would be holding celebrations. So if you think about, and I just mentioned that welfare framing really ignores the plight of animals and really fails to see them as victims. this is a perfect example, because if we really took the perspective that these animals' lives, just like ours, are no different, we would not be holding celebrations if our friends and family were being exploited just a little bit better. And so if we kind of draw that parallel and see animals as the actual victims that they are, this idea of like these hens holding celebrations of them being exploited in a better way is so degrading and demeaning. And then this is another example, and it basically says, I'm sorry if you can't see, but I tried to highlight it. It basically says, if California voters pass Prop 2 next Tuesday, this is from a while back, but still a good example, it will be the greatest victory for animals in US history. And again, it just shows that this completely ignoring the animals as victims, because obviously if we took the victim's perspective and asked this pig or the chickens that are being confined and are screaming and suffering, if they consider this a greatest victory, obviously they don't. So this idea of animal welfare, and I just briefly want to talk about companies such as Whole Foods and Chipotle use this idea of humane and use it as basically an opportunity for marketing. And as we've all seen before, this is Chipotle with claiming that they treat animals like animals. The best way to treat animals is with dignity and respect, and to allow them to display their natural tendency. And how do they do this? They basically talk about the farmers that are doing a great job, and there's a stamp right there from Neiman Ranch that says raised with care. So basically what they're doing is they're taking advantage of this idea of animal welfare and using it to their advantage. And so I just ask a question here: is this a commitment to welfare or a deceptive marketing ploy? And I mean, if you look at how these companies use these ideas to their advantage, it's clear that their only interest is to profit off of exploitation. They have zero interest in animal welfare. And we'll see more of this later in the video, but Whole Foods talks about how values matter, and they have all these advertisements and talking about how they take care of the animals that they kill, but in reality they're just using this idea of animal welfare to their advantage because they can. So what did we actually see when we went to a certified humane farm? And as Wayne talked earlier, this is the best of the best. And what we saw was suffering, misery, disease, filth, and death. And I'm sorry about some of the images that I'm going to be showing you. But just to showcase the reality, I mean, we just talked about the welfarist framing. We talked about how companies use it to their advantage and create this impossible image. But when you actually go inside of these places, what you find is really no different than what you would find in any other places of exploitation and violence. So we found death at the certified humane farm. This is one of the hens that we rescued. Her name is Sephi, and she's actually standing on top of one of another dead hen. We found filth at the certified humane farm. And we found mutilation at the certified humane farm. And interestingly enough, the CEO of Whole Foods talks about, or actually made a statement saying, there will be no mutilation at any Whole Foods farm. And this is just a showcase that when you have a place where animals are being exploited, regardless of how you claim to treat them, and regardless of how many standards you put talking about how you're going to treat animals humanely, this is just it's imminent. It's bound to happen because the actual system is so inherently violent. You can't really prevent these things from happening. So this is actually a wing of one of the hens, and even though they say there's no mutilation at Whole Foods farm, this is mutilation at a Whole Foods supplier. And let's see. So where does welfarism leave us? And the two questions that I think we ought to ask ourselves is does it leave us on the side of the animals or on the side of the oppressor? And clearly, if we look at welfarism through the perspective of animals, it kind of, if we're taking that perspective, we are definitely siding more with the oppressor. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about why DXC Dreams Big. I know that Sapphire referenced our organizing principles, and one of DXC's organizing principle is to dream big. Welfarism seeks to achieve animal liberation, or new welfarism seeks to achieve animal liberation without challenging the property status of animals and without individualizing animals. But at DXC, we seek to achieve animal liberation by challenging the property status of animals, by talking about animals as individuals and telling their stories, and by confronting speciesism in society, hence mobilizing activists all over the world to take nonviolent direct action. I just wanted to show everyone this image, and basically, there's this idea that obviously companies like Whole Foods and Chipotle, who talk about how they love animals, really care for them. But if you cared about animals, you wouldn't be confining them and putting them in position or subjecting them to violence. So basically it says, this is what confining them looks like, and this is what caring for them looks like. And I will let the video speak more to this. I always perceived as DXC's approach on this being one of my favorite blogs that Wayne wrote. It's called The Open Model, and this is DXC's model. And basically the point of that blog post is just, we're trying to create a movement, and movement building is about inclusiveness, not exclusiveness. And regardless of these ideas, after the release of this investigation, all of us had conversations with various different people, and one of the people who I had a conversation with, talked about this and basically said, like, we don't really like that you want to try to build bridges, yet you're criticizing our approach. And I know I talked to Brian and Wayne about this, and basically, I told this person, I think we had a fairly good conversation, that there's so many people who work for, welfare reforms and organizations that are really good people, and they genuinely believe that they're doing a really good thing. But does that mean we shouldn't criticize or look from a skeptical point of view of their approach? I think we should always be honest, but also invite their perspective, and like Wayne said, be willing to hear what people like Bruce Friedrich and others have to say. So that's my perspective. We have to, in order to create a movement, we need unity, and there's no way we can have unity if we're trying to exclude people, especially based on what Bronwyn said, which is like identity politics. It's so irrelevant.
So I wanted to say, I'm pretty new at the whole thing. I've been a vegetarian just for 4 months and a vegan 2 months. So, and I grew up in Greece. I don't know if that really has to do with it, but it is true that in Greece there are very few people that are even vegetarians. Anyway, so I grew up, I always loved animals a lot, but never associated. I was always eating meat and, with my family, and they still eat meat. And so because I'm very new at this whole thing, I'm still trying to figure out, for example, this thing you're doing right now with Whole Foods and Chipotle, I'm still trying to figure out the purpose, because in my brain I do believe that factory farming is 100 times worse. But anyway, it's the ultimate hell. It's very, very bad. So when I compare what's going on there with the cows I see in Petaluma where I live, free, for example, roaming around, and I know that they are gonna get killed at some point, I would want to fight more against the farm factories than focusing on that. So I'm trying to understand why you're doing this, because still in my head I have a little. My dad, for example, keeps telling me that the wolf is gonna eat the cow anyway. So we are stronger species, like from the animals. So it's in the nature at some point to be able to kill them and eat them. So I'm happy that I have managed this. My family has promised me that they never buy, they're very careful where they buy their meat from. So he's telling me that, why don't you understand that the wolf would eat the cow, a person would hunt and kill and eat the animal. so this part he understands. He doesn't understand though the caged, the caged thing, the crates and animals will not be able to move at all and all that. Anyway, so I'm trying to understand why Whole Foods, what are you trying to do? Because most of the meat out there is not from good farms anyway, it's from factory farms. So why not fight that first and then, yes?
So, does anyone else want to chime in?
No, sorry.
Before Brian. Brian, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, I just wanted to say something brief. John Sanbonmatsu, who's a scholar of the animal rights movement and critical theory and social justice, has said famously that humane meat is the wobbly linchpin holding together the entire system of meat. And that's really kind of where we're coming at this from, is I think, at least from my understanding, if we can destabilize the idea of humane meat with public consciousness, then we can bring down the whole system. And you know this probably from anecdotal experience on your own. If you talk to someone and you say, oh, you know, even if you just believe that factory farming is wrong, and factory farming is the vast majority of the case. I mean, you know, Jonathan Safran Foer has documented that, you know, 99% of the animals that we murder for food are, you know, held in factory farm conditions. But if you say this to people, they say, oh no, I agree with you. Factory farming is wrong, but I believe in humane meat. And the disproportionate 99%, you know, including animals, you know, at facilities like this, that it's a factory farm. It's not a humane farm. The whole system is justified by this idea of humane meat. Even companies like McDonald's, you know, companies like Chipotle that obviously, you know, process their animals in an entirely industrial sense are relying on this idea of humane meat to justify the system. So in order to really bring it down, we do have to focus on this idea of humane meat.
Anyone else want anything?
I think one of my responses to that question is, I think one of the most upsetting pieces of footage in that video, and of all the footage I've ever seen, is the cow waiting for slaughter. And we have no idea what her life was like, if she was on a green field with her family, or if she was in a feedlot or what. But it doesn't really matter, because she's waiting for slaughter and we know what she's going through right in that moment, and that's wrong. So that's why I feel like if we talk too much about, you know, factory farm versus the other things, we ignore the fact that at the end of the day, like, there's this violent, horrifying end, and that's the problem. So I think that's generally my response, and like Brian is saying, like, almost all the non-vegans that I know claim humane meat, every single one of them. Like, and obviously they're not doing that for every meal that they're eating animals or animal products, but they all do that. So that's why I think it's important to confront the lie that is humane meat, because that cow could have been humanely raised, but that's still horrifying footage. You know, it's still incredibly, like, that's the essence of what's wrong with it.
So you're talking about the end, right?
Yeah, they're all killed.
What they say to that is that if I don't kill it, the lion will, for example.
But that's not actually true, because these animals are forced into creation because of us. And we don't have to. Like, her death is unnecessary. Lions aside, her death is unnecessary.
And that's not true, because many times animals are rescued, including the animals we took. And I mean, it actually wouldn't take that much money to take every single animal from a factory farm or a humane farm and put them into a sanctuary. And we're talking probably roughly 3 to 4% of GDP, which is a lot of money. It's hundreds of billions of dollars, but it's not unprecedented. When we had to rebuild Europe and Japan and Asia after World War II, we spent probably twice as much money rebuilding other countries. And we have a moral obligation to these animals. I mean, we have for, you know, at least 10,000 years, really for 250,000 years, been engaged in horribly violent acts against other animals. And we talk about reparations. We have to make reparations to the other life on this planet for the horrible things our species has done. And I think that starts by making the very simple point that killing them is wrong.
Also, we don't take our moral beliefs from lions, usually. I mean, just, you know, in terms of picking an obligate carnivore to model one particular area of our moral behavior on, while you know, we also don't greet each other by sniffing each other's behinds, and we wear clothes. We do a lot of things that, you know, so it's a little bizarre that humans like to claim moral superiority over animals like lions, and then at the same time, well, they do it, so I can too, and that's how I'm going to model my moral behavior. So there's a very bizarre inconsistency when people, I don't know, isolate, usually lions. Lions, that's everyone's favorite. So I just kind of want to point out that as well, that it's a little silly to model our behavior on lions in this one particular thing.
Let's go to Pax real quick.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add on to what you were saying about when you see the cows grazing in the fields, you're not seeing their death, you're not seeing the end, but what you're also not seeing is the beginning. I mean, as been pointed out, those cows only exist because we breed them, and it's almost always forcible insemination. So it's, I mean, basically they're taking a vial full of bull semen and putting it into a cow's vagina and then taking the calf away. And that's happens on so-called humane farms as well. That's not just for factory farming. So you're not seeing that. You're not seeing castration without anesthesia. That is also perfectly okay on so-called humane farms. You're not, basically you're just seeing a brief moment in this animal's life and saying, oh, well, they look happy because they're out in the ground. I'm not saying you were saying this, but the people, like, you know, that you pointed out, they were saying this. They're not seeing the beginning, they're not seeing the end, they're just seeing this momentary vision, and they think, oh, well, that animal's fine with it. But that's just not reality.
Priya?
Yeah, I just wanted to answer that question by addressing something I know we talked about earlier during the presentation. I don't think you were here, but you know, humane meat, or this idea of killing animals humanely, the one thing it definitely ignores is the victim's perspective. I mean, and if we put ourselves in the shoes of non-human animals who are being killed, or like Lisa talked about, that cow who is about to be slaughtered, and we asked ourselves, like, would we want to be in that position? We would, surely most of us would say, no, we don't want to be in that position. And the second thing is, you know, this idea of that Whole Foods and companies like Chipotle are putting out there, they're co-opting the animal rights message, and they're not doing it to be, I mean, it's not coming from a place of good, because the end goal for them is to make profit. But they're using our messaging, which is, we care about animals. I mean, you see a poster of them saying, know how your dinner lived. I mean, those graphics are pretty similar to ours. Their messaging is different. You know, we use similar graphics of people holding chickens and animals and talking about how we love them. The only difference is that they want to kill them and make money, and
Small difference.
a small difference, and all of us want to see those animals happy and free.
Buck?
So like there are, like, I occasionally wander around and see chickens and cows on farms. So the 99% of animals factory farmed figure, is that, so that's, you know, almost all of those animals are going to be chickens, right?
I think it's like 90% or something, 95%, something like that, yeah.
What is it of other, like, animals?
That I don't know, and that I would highly recommend looking in the appendix of Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals, which
That's what everyone says to me.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
See, I actually would not recommend that book.
Yeah,
I think it's filled with factual errors. It just doesn't. He doesn't.
Okay.
He's not. He's not an activist, and he's not a scholar. He's a popular writer, and it's filled with so many errors that it is honestly, like, it's upsetting to me to read that book, because I just.
That's why I was recommending the appendix. I was going to say.
Yeah, but I just don't think he did his due diligence on anything. I mean, I'm sure he had good intentions, but some of the things he says are just factually and ethically problematic to me. So, I mean, but it's a beautiful book in a lot of ways, and so I think it's well worth reading for other reasons, but not because you're trying to get valid, factual, or ethical points.
Do you have other recommendations?
Oh, geez. I mean, there's a lot that's great that's written. I still think, I mean, everyone's going to hate me for saying this. I still think the first chapter of Animal Liberation is the best thing ethically that's been written about animal rights. And I know, I mean, everyone says Peter Singer's a welfarist. You can't say anything good about him. That chapter is powerful. It talks very elegantly about speciesism and what speciesism is and how it lies at the root of all discrimination and violence against animals. And no one's written anything better on that subject since then, in my opinion. I mean, there's a reason he's the most distinguished philosopher of the past 50 years. He's a very brilliant man and a very brilliant writer, too. But that's usually what I recommend people read, at least if they like reading that sort of thing. But I mean, other people have other recommendations. I actually, frankly, think beyond that, a lot of stuff outside of the animal rights movement, even just like watching Finding Nemo, with the right frame of mind, like thinking of it not just as, I mean, obviously it's a cartoon, there's a lot of anthropomorphization, but the messaging is actually very powerful if you accept it for what it is. which is that, all animals want to be safe from harm.
Brother Bear.
I know that people watch Brother Bear here too.
Brian, I've read some people say that we can't compare the animal rights movement to slavery because basically animals cannot, unlike slaves and freed black people who were slaves, they cannot assist in their own liberation, so it's not a valid comparison when we try to say that therefore we should use the same tactics as abolitionism or immediatism as it was called at the time. What would you say to that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that that is true to some extent, but I don't see the relevance to some of the specific things that were discussed. I don't see, for example, the relevance of that to the idea that we should be strongly advocating our position. I think the same arguments for why we should be strongly advocating our position hold whether or not the victims can effectively make those statements themselves. So I think that's true. There are definitely, obviously there are differences between these two movements, but I think that, some of those differences are independent of some of the ways that we should be going about doing that. Does that at all answer the question? I mean, it's not a very specific
it's not my
answer.
argument, it's just one that I've read several times, but I don't see, personally how that leads to saying that welfarism is a better approach. It just, it just seems like a point of contention without a solution to me.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, if anything, I think it honestly makes an even stronger case for why we should be doing open rescue and why we should be telling their stories, because, it's harder to cross the species barrier, right, to effectively communicate those stories, which means we need to be trying even harder to do that rather than not doing it at all.
Okay.
Yeah, and we focus, I guess, we try hard to bring the animal voices to our actions and to our writings. And I think in some of our leaflets, we tell the stories of these animals from a first-person perspective, and we try to do it very carefully and not give too much specifics because, we're both humans and we both speak the same language, English, but I can't perfectly understand your experience. And so, you can tell me and then I can try to tell someone else, well, my friend Pax had this, and even that is not going to be completely accurate or authentic, but it's going to be much better. And someone who speaks English as a second language or doesn't speak English at all, but they're human, I'm going to be able to understand them pretty well and translate for others. And so what we're trying to do is translate. The animals are asking for help, and we're trying to translate that to a language that humans can understand. And so I think that the idea that animals, we're trying to be in solidarity with animals, we're making an effort. And I'm not saying that effort is perfect, and we welcome criticism and ideas of how we can do that better. Because I think that we know we can be better at it, and we're not sure how. And so, but we're making a constant effort to try to be better at being in solidarity with animals instead of speaking for them. But in a lot of ways, we have to speak for them.
I guess part of the argument that says that we shouldn't address this the same way as we would slavery is the animals would say, I want relief now. I want that extra 2 square inches, or I want that serpentine ramp or whatever, just because that would immediately help me right now. That's not my argument, but that's one thing that I've heard. Even if, ultimately we, of course, want, well, most of us want all of the animals to be free, that how could we deny them that immediate relief? That's not fair for us to think, oh, you would want to be free, you wouldn't want to have this interim reform. How can you say that on their behalf?
Yeah.
So,
So if two things I'd say about that. One is most of the relief that's being offered them now is an illusion. It's not actual relief, and that was one of the really important points of our investigation and why we felt like it was really important to investigate the best of the best, right? Because this is supposed to be relief they're receiving. And I didn't have to personally experience what those hens were going through, but even just walking through that facility and having to care for some of those hens afterwards, I'm still having nightmares about it, right? This is the relief.
And maybe it is better. I haven't seen any differences. Maybe it is better in some marginal way, but it's not significantly better in any way that I can appreciate. And I doubt they can appreciate it either, you know, because they're still confined, they're still going through mutilation, they're still dying, they're still in distress and disease. So the fundamentals haven't changed. The second thing is, just from an efficacy perspective, I don't see much of a historical or social scientific argument for how asking for welfare reforms has actually improved welfare. So, you know, the slide that Priya put up, which said that Prop 2 is the greatest victory for farm animals in the history of the United States, that's clearly false. The greatest victory for farm animals is clearly the Humane Slaughter Act in, I think it was 1955, which is federal legislation that barred all animals, well, you know, all non-poultry animals, but all, they had the poultry exemption, but in theory, all animals who are being killed for food would have to be unconscious before they were eviscerated and torn to pieces. That was over 50 years ago, and we can ask ourselves, one, did it actually improve the slaughter process? And most of the journalists and independent investigators who have actually looked at slaughter facilities have said, no, it didn't seem to appreciably change. I mean, we still have up to 5% failure rates in all these slaughterhouses. It's not being enforced at all. No one really cares. Once in a while, someone's cited, but it's a slap on the wrist. Secondly, even if that law didn't itself improve welfare reforms, did it lead us down the path to greater welfare reforms? And again, if you look from 1955 to the present day, I certainly haven't seen much of an improvement in animal welfare. If anything, we've gone in the wrong direction. You know, so and I don't think, if there's no historical argument for this causing improved welfare reforms, and there's no social scientific reason or theoretical reason to think it will improve welfare, then even if you're, you know, Brian and I have discussed this, even if I were a welfarist, I would pretend to be a liberationist to do the best effective welfare reform that I could. Because setting that standard very high and saying, you know, I am going to anchor our objective very far from here, and maybe we'll get a little progress because I've anchored it so far, is the approach that I would take personally if I were a welfarist. So it's a strange argument to me, because you look at the Humane Slaughter Act and you have to ask yourself, I mean, it's not even us who's saying it's problematic. We're talking about newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times who said, like, this act is a farce. It's doing nothing.
Just factual correction quickly. The quote is, it's the biggest victory for animals since the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The quote she had?
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
So, yeah, he
might have thought that the Humane Slaughter Act was a bigger victory. Yeah. But I've definitely seen other people say things like that, and it always strikes me as being, you know, Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1955 said if you went by mail alone, you'd think the entire country were only concerned about humane slaughter. We've never reached that point. And it's in many ways we've backslided from that point, because this is a time period where there was a lot of muckraking. It was kind of the beginning of widespread industrial agriculture, and there was significant concern about it. And because there was no animal rights movement, we never realized the concern into anything significant. Instead, what we got was the Humane Slaughter Act, which has been a farce. You know, there's widespread accounts from investigators at the FDA saying they go to the slaughterhouse and they're locked out and they won't let them in. They just leave. It's like, this is animal welfare. And this is the most significant federal legislation in the history of this country.
And it doesn't apply to chickens,
it doesn't apply
or turkeys,
to
or ducks.
Or bunnies, apparently.
Or fish.
Or bunnies, yeah.
And
so all the animals that are most violated.
The #1 slaughtered farmed animal worldwide. I mean, there's like, what, 50 billion a year or something like that? So for it to not even apply to birds is just,
it's a farce.
Makes it's worse than a farce. It's just insulting that people would consider this even any kind of minor victory, in my opinion.
Coming back to something Pac said, you said that, you know, if you were really listening, taking the victim's perspective, then, you know, we would want to implement the welfare reforms because that's what the animals who are
I wasn't saying that.
Oh, yeah. No. Reiterating the argument that
just as this is being filmed, I wanted to
Sorry,
You're going to get kicked out of all the abolitionists. You're lucky we're inclusive, Pax.
Yeah, so the argument that you were sharing was that, you know, because the animals currently want, would want those improvements, assuming that the improvements were real, which, we've already established are almost always not, then the animals who are currently alive would want them. But let's just say, if they were effective, then that'd be good, and if this wasn't a stumbling block towards liberation, then of course we would do that. But if it's a hindrance, so if it's if the animals for the next 10 years are going to have this slight improvement, and this is obviously a wildly optimistic expectation, but liberation would have happened in 5 years if we didn't have that improvement, then you would have to also be taking into account all the animals who are not yet you know, brought into existence and what they would want. And what they would want is for, you know, the, you know, minority who are having the worst conditions now to, you know, sacrifice on behalf of the, like, you know, 10 times more who would have been liberated otherwise. So it's just sort of like, you also have to, like, for that argument, it gets more complicated by just taking into account the animals who, if this slows down liberation, then take into account the lives of the animals who would not have been taken into account.
I just want to say one thing. To me, I'm fairly new to the whole idea of animal welfarism. I never really have heard of it so much, but to me, there's probably a much better way to word this, but it just seems like bullshit. Because, I'm sorry, but I mean, it just, like, there doesn't seem to be any welfare. It just seems like it's just like you showed at the farm. It's just trickery to get people away from thinking about the real issues, you know, and so by doing that, it seems like a hindrance, you know, like, and I think what we need to just keep pushing for is, you know, that people treat animals with care and respect and not just treat them like, you know, they're a rock or something. And it's, I don't know, but I guess that's my main point, was just that welfarism just, it doesn't seem to be real. Like, it just seems like a fantasy term, because any little thing that they're saying is animal welfarism. It's like, but what is that? It's nothing. It's not significant. It's not really helping, at least in my eyes. Yeah. I don't know, does that make sense? Yeah. Or, okay.
No, I think when you said respect, that's the key, is the public thinks that you can kill respectfully.
Yeah.
They think that as long as the animal is treated with loving kindness, whatever that means, from the conditions that we've seen here to someone who raises the animals in their own backyard and actually treats them like a family member and then slits their throat, they still somehow thinks that is respectful. That's the problem, I think.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on that. Yeah, what you said just made me think about the fact that animal welfare is basically an institutionalized way for society to deal with the horrible things that we do to animals. It's like partly feel good, and then companies like Whole Foods and Chipotle and all these other companies just, you know, basically market this idea because they can profit off of it, and it's like this vicious circle. So yeah, absolutely, it's trickery at its best.
And just, I mean, what I had talked about before with cognitive dissonance, I think this is, you know, when people have this kind of moral dilemma, whenever you have moral decisions to make, you first have this very visceral, intuitive gut decision about something, and then you kind of look for the logic to fill it in, right? It's kind of just generally how we make moral decisions. When people are coming in contact with this, the hardest thing to do is to really change the way you're thinking about, you know, whatever the issue is, to make your views harmonious with each other. It's a lot easier to latch on to something that will justify what you're doing and not make a change. So when these messages are available to people, they will latch on. They seem a little bizarre to us, right? Because we made it harder. I think all people who have adopted an anti-speciesist philosophy have made that harder change. And it's not the fault of people who have gone for that, you know, way of viewing things, because it's being spread out there, but I think this is why people are latching on. It's a lot easier to latch on to that and to not change your behavior and to not change the way you're thinking.
Well, it's going to sound like a circular logic, and probably it is. What I'm going to say. So in this context, somehow each time when someone says human, it somehow always ends being human-centered.
Yeah.
That's just my read of the word human in this context.
Yeah.
There's no human in this context whatsoever. Is it circular logic?
No.
No, I think it's right. I mean, no, I agree with that completely. I think it's always humane from the perspective of the farmer, humane from the perspective of the consumer, not humane from the perspective of, I mean, this is the point Priya was making earlier. It's like, one of the things, there were a lot of things that really annoyed me about the New York Times article, but in the first sentence they said that our investigation found what we thought were inhumane conditions. And I hate that word so much, and I never use that word. I've never said that word in advocacy, and I never said that word in the New York Times. I know that because I have a visceral, emotional reaction to that word whenever I hear anyone say it. Like, I don't like the word. And yet that's the way they described it, because the New York Times is trying to fit our investigation, our messaging, into their perspective, which was human-centered. It's like from the consumer's perspective, from the farmer's perspective, from the corporation's perspective. And it was one of the most disappointing things about the article. But you know, that's a story for another day, the issues we had at the times. Still, I think an incredible success, and I think, you know, obviously we had to make a judgment call as to whether to work with these reporters, even though we knew that they were historically very supportive of certain companies that obviously we're not as supportive of, but it was difficult.
The other thing to point out is that this is actually part of the organizing principles under the first one. Yeah, humane is not the same as good, reason is not the same as value.
Well, I hope I was short my turn.
Any other thoughts or comments? Otherwise, we're getting close to 4.
I just have some closing thoughts, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, we just had a really great discussion, and I just wanted to tie it in with tomorrow. Tomorrow's our big day of action, and as everyone here knows, DXC has monthly days of action. And you know, I've seen in the last, especially in the last few weeks, I have seen Wayne work like tirelessly, sleepless nights on this video. And one of the things that he said, which really still sticks with me, is that there's so many of these hens that we left behind. And tomorrow, symbolically, at least to me, and hopefully all of us, is a way for us to speak up for those who we could not help. Because that is the hardest part to think about, is that there's so many of them, you know, we left behind. And hopefully, I mean, not hopefully, this will happen starting tomorrow. We are not only speaking up for these animals, but we're also saying we need to help them. And it can only happen if we mobilize and become stronger and bigger, and with the message of animal liberation.
Oh, so unrelated, just about the carpool. So we're starting a carpool system. So if you have a car and you're interested in, and you could give someone a ride, we're trying to get a list of people who are willing to do that. There are a lot of benefits, just saving people time, giving people who are not near transportation